In early August, an incident happened on the streets of Ithaca that set off a conversation about the relationship between the city of Ithaca's police force and the communities they protect and serve. That incident resulted in an out-of-uniform white IPD officer pulling his gun on two unarmed black teenagers. As a result of that incident, Ithaca Mayor Svante Myrick issued what he called his Plan for Excellence in Policing that included a number of recommendations for how to make the IPD more effective. Well, this week, one of the parts of that plan came a bit closer to becoming a reality. And here to talk about just what has happened this week is Jeff Stein of the Ithaca Voice. Jeff, thanks so much for coming by.
Sam, a real pleasure. Always glad to be on WRFI.
Yeah, so I mentioned that there's part of this Plan for Excellence in Policing that's kind of made another step forward. Can you actually tell us what's happened?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure that this advancement of this part of the plan constitutes a real surprise. The mayor's, 8-step proposal involves lots of measures that were controversial and remain controversial, in particular the residency requirement, which would require cops to live within the city limits, although it's been since watered down. But what's really phenomenal and really, I think, interesting about the body cameras idea is that it enjoys healthy support not only from the critics of the institution, but from within the institution itself. And how often that happens in political discourse, you could probably count on one hand. But you have an institutional reform that outsiders want, that the police themselves say they want. They say with open arms that they want these body cameras. Another voice in support of this idea was the Community Police Board, which met this week and said they're on board. And then there are some other questions about this whole idea that we can talk about here.
Mm-hmm. So the Community Police Board has given their kind of vote of approval to the use of these body cameras. And you mentioned that the IPD is in favor of this as well.
Right, which I think is surprising to a lot of people. But I think from their perspective, they don't see what they do as wrong. And they think that if you could have visual evidence of what their jobs are really like, it would be a lot tougher for people to criticize them from the outside. If you were really to force yourself to watch in real time what they have to deal with. And I know the chief really thinks this, and with good reason, that the ambiguity and uncertainty over controversial incidents like this would probably disappear, and then you wouldn't have this sort of confusion.
So I'm wondering if we can just kind of lay out who is actually on the Community Police Board.
Mostly people who are involved in other walks of life. It's not a professional full-time job for anyone. Mm-hmm. I know one of the women in charge is in DSS. A pastor is involved. A member of the African American community, or several, which I think is fitting given how often those issues tend to occur, especially with the August incident. Mm-hmm. It has sort of shifted character a little bit over the last 10 years. Gino Bush, who you may have known, left the police board. He says he was forced out, and is very angry about that. He was a very outspoken critic of the city and of the mayor's office, and has been throughout this whole incident.
Mm-hmm. So it seems like this board is kind of comprised of many different parts of the community.
That's right, and they seem, for better or worse, depending on your perspective, a lot less confrontational with the police department itself, and much more interested in collaboration.
So if these kind of officer cameras, if they've made this next step forward, how is the city actually going to pay for something like this?
I know the city has a guarantee of private donation, I believe, from Park. The Park Foundation has agreed to pay for most of the cameras, if not all. And the real question is what happens with upkeep when this becomes a recurring fee in the city's budget. That's something we have to tangle with, and I think is going to be discussed more and more as this moves forward.
And I'm actually curious kind of about the larger effectiveness of a step like this, of using police cameras. I mean, you mentioned earlier that it does shed sunlight, right? It brings light to what the police are dealing with, and in an event where there's questions that are being asked, who did what, it might be able to, bring some new perspective onto those kind of incidents. But are there any kind of pitfalls to police using cameras like this?
And it's good you say that, because when the whole thing happened in Ferguson, police body cameras emerged very quickly as a solution that a lot of people got behind. And since then, numerous cities, dozens across the country, have implemented them. And yes, there has been some unexpected fallout. I think in particular, there's concerns over privacy, a sort of an Orwellian nature. We got cameras everywhere now. That would clearly be the case with or without police body cameras. But I think, people have serious privacy concerns if this stuff becomes subject to open records law, which it should be. I was reading earlier that there's some discussion over, what happens if a police officer can sell a tape of a celebrity being pulled over. And so I think that might be a legitimate concern. At the meeting, I think Shirley Kane, one of the co-chairs, was telling me that she thinks it's going to be crucially important to figure out where this data gets stored. So, right, you're going to have cops wearing cameras and recording their interactions. But what happens to those recordings? Are they stored externally, or do they get sent back to IPD? And Shirley Kane was making the point that she thinks, the potential for a conflict of interest if the video is sent back to the cops is much higher. And then you would have evidence that someone did something wrong, potentially being kept by the IPD. So I think that's going to be a very interesting discussion as it moves forward. Who gets to hold on to this stuff? And does it become extremely expensive to have someone else? And if an external contractor gets to process data from interactions, that should be outside the community, right? Because I don't want someone looking at all the police footage over weeks, right? So I think there's some interesting privacy questions, but I think the main takeaway from the board was that they're very much in favor of moving this forward. And surprisingly, with the support of both the cops and the protesters who spoke so strongly against the cops in August.
So if this has happened this week, what is the next step to actually getting these on IPD officers?
I believe Deputy Chief Townsend is supposed to be coming up with a policy for how that would work. And there's lots of models. I believe Philly is now looking at doing this, and Seattle just implemented, and now St. Louis, I believe, has also implemented a policy. So I think drafting some technical language about when police have to start filming, if they have to declare that they're filming, under what circumstances is it appropriate, and then moving forward with the actual purchases. I know they still haven't picked a vendor yet, so I'm sure that won't be that tough to sort out. When there's demand, there's a marketer, right? Someone will sell it to them. But that's a question, one of the questions that has to be resolved before this thing moves forward.
Gotcha. And since we're talking about the relationship between the city and the community and maybe perceptions about what the IPD is doing and dealing with, I know that the Ithaca Voice ran a story today about crime rates in Ithaca, and I was hoping that we could talk about that a little bit.
Happy to talk about that.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if you can just kind of summarize what the story was about.
To me, it was sort of, I would just walk around town and everyone, and you'd see it in the Facebook comments, you'd see it at City Hall, you'd see it all over town. And I'm sure you've heard it as well, where people said crime is making this city look like Syracuse or Binghamton. To me, and I've known this for a while, but it's just totally unsupported by fact. And the notion that crime rates are starting to rival those of the major metropolitan areas in upstate New York and our beloved little community here is just wrong. And I felt like it was important for us to let people know that notion, that there's really, that fear is unfounded at this point. And I don't deny that there is crime and that it is scary for those who it happens to. It's traumatic and horrible. But I think some data and perspective was badly needed.
You actually dug into some kind of hard federal data about crime rates.
Right. So the data does show that crime in Ithaca is at best flatlining. I should say at worst flatlining, at best declining. And you've actually, in the last 2 decades across the U.S., seen a decline in crime rates overall, especially violent crime. And yet, national studies show that Americans think there is more crime, even as we're among one of the safest periods in world history, right? But people are more scared than ever. And that's not just an anecdote. That's there are studies that show that. And the paradox there, I think, is solved by the problem of social media and clickbait and people pushing crime news out all the time because it sells. So I think that's sort of an imperative on us as journalists to be sure that we get the message out there that crime is actually low, or, maybe not low from some people's perspective, but certainly not exploding, certainly not soaring the way I hear it talked about.
And I'm wondering, did you reach out to the IPD for comment about these numbers, and what did they say?
Yeah, I met with the chief and the PIO for the police department, and it was funny because he was saying, I go to the grocery store and someone comes up to me and says, "Chief, you got to get the crime rate down. It's out of control." And he has to sit there and calmly explain that, no, it's actually pretty much the same as it was 5 years ago. So I think they were happy to get that message out there as well. And they were saying, like, look, every year we post our crime data and it's not changing, and yet people come to us and say the crime rate is out of control, and just factually isn't. So they were very much in agreement with both my sort of intuition that people talk about the crime in Ithaca as if it's exploding, and the factual nature of the matter, which is that it's not.
And so why do you think that is? Like, why do you think that the perception is the way it is that crime is on the rise?
I think really it's in part to do with the splintering of news, whereas, and maybe The Voice is in some degree responsible for this as a new media model, but 15 years ago, the paper would come out with one top story headline, and then the crime would be, unless it was really wild, buried on page 3. But now, with Facebook links being generated as individual entities, you're pushing out stories decoupled from their placement in the paper and the size of the headline. So whereas a newspaper editor may have felt compelled to do a 60-point sans serif headline on the front page of, let's say, the Journal, that link is now getting shared directly from their page and being passed around as if it's, the top story headline. And so there's no discernment on the web about, is this the most important thing going on? The national studies that have looked into this have found that TV news has fallen back on crime reporting, especially as TV news has been hit by the internet, hit by falling revenue. They've gone back to the bread and butter of just crime. And they've sort of discovered, like a lot of people, that crime tends to be popular. So I think, TV is as guilty as we are. I don't know if that's much of a defense, but our plan from now on is to embed a link to that story every time we run a big crime news alert. So it lets people know, this is the context, this is the background.
Mm-hmm, just to provide some of that perspective.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Jeff Stein is the editor of the Ithaca Voice. We've been talking about a recent update on what's happening with one part of Mayor Svante Myrick's plan for excellence in policing, as well as some recent data on crime trends in Ithaca. Jeff, thank you so much for taking the time to come by and chat.
Sam, a real pleasure anytime.